Welcome to Picture Mavericks, where every frame has a story. Today we are looking at a film from 1996 that most people remember as a teen thriller. A young woman meets a dangerous man, things escalate, and the third act turns into a home invasion. On the surface, that description is accurate, but it undersells what the film is actually doing at a structural level. Fear, directed by James Foley and released in 1996, is a more carefully constructed film than its reputation suggests. And the reason it still holds up nearly 30 years later is not the tension of its final act. It is the precision of everything that comes before it. The film opens by establishing Nicole as its fixed point of view. She is 16 years old, living in Seattle with her father Steve, her stepmother Laura, and her younger stepbrother Toby. The family is comfortable, the home is well presented, and Steve is protective in the way that fathers of teenage daughters tend to be in films like this. That setup is deliberate. The film needs the audience to understand Nicole's world as ordered and stable before it begins to introduce disorder. Everything the audience is shown in the opening act is functioning the way it is supposed to function, which means the arrival of David is going to register as an addition to that world rather than a warning signal. That is the first structural decision the film makes, and it is the correct one. David is introduced at a party, and the film frames his arrival entirely through Nicole's perspective. He is older, composed, and he directs his full attention toward her in a way that feels significant rather than calculated. The film does not immediately signal to the audience that this attention is a technique. It allows the audience to experience David the way Nicole experiences him. This is where the film earns its credibility as a thriller. A less confident film would insert early warning signs, small moments of visible menace designed to keep the audience ahead of the protagonist. Fear largely resists that approach in its first act. David is charming because the film commits to showing him as charming. The audience is not watching a girl fall for someone the film has already coded as dangerous. The audience is watching a relationship form in real time, and the danger develops inside that relationship rather than arriving from outside it. Mark Wahlberg's performance is central to this working. The character requires him to be genuinely engaging before he becomes threatening, and the film does not ask him to carry a visible undercurrent of menace throughout. David believes in his own version of the relationship. That is what makes him credible and what makes the film's escalation feel earned rather than mechanical. The shift begins quietly. David becomes present in Nicole's life in a way that gradually moves from attentive to constant. He wants to know where she is. He becomes uncomfortable when she interacts with male friends. He reframes her existing relationships as threats rather than treating them as the normal social context of her life. The film communicates this escalation through accumulation rather than through a single dramatic reveal. Each individual behavior could be read as insecurity or protectiveness in isolation. It is the pattern that becomes legible as something more systematic. That is a structurally accurate way to portray this kind of dynamic, and it is more sophisticated than most thrillers of this period were willing to be. The violence that eventually surfaces is presented as the visible end of a process that has been operating invisibly from early in the relationship. The film does not treat the violence as a transformation of David's character. It treats it as a clarification of something that was already present in how he related to Nicole from the beginning. Nicole's father Steve functions as a parallel narrative line, and the film uses him carefully. His initial approval of David is not presented as negligence. It is presented as the result of seeing David in a context where David is choosing to perform well. Steve is a competent and attentive parent who is working with the information available to him. When his assessment of David changes, it changes because the evidence changes, not because he was previously blind to something obvious. This matters because it keeps the film from becoming a story about adult failure. Steve is not the reason Nicole is in danger. David is. The film is consistent about where responsibility sits. The dynamic between Nicole and Steve is also handled with more care than the premise requires. Steve's protectiveness of Nicole is established early, and it creates friction between them in the way that parental protectiveness often does with teenagers. That friction is not resolved by Steve being proven right. It is resolved by Nicole and Steve having to function together under genuine threat. The relationship between them by the end of the film has more weight than it did at the beginning, and that development is earned through the structure of what they go through together. The final act moves the film into a different register. The tension that has been psychological and relational becomes physical and immediate. David and a group of associates move on the family home directly. Some critics at the time felt this shift was too conventional, that the film abandoned its more interesting psychological territory in favor of a standard thriller climax. That is a fair observation. The final act operates on different terms than the first two-thirds of the film, but there is an argument that the shift is structurally intentional. The film has spent its first two acts showing how control operates through proximity, attention, and the gradual redefinition of what is normal. The final act shows what happens when that system of control is rejected completely. The escalation to direct confrontation is presented as the logical endpoint of a dynamic that has nowhere else to go once Nicole refuses to return. The film does not present the resolution as a restoration of safety. The final images make clear that the experience has changed the family permanently. That choice is more honest than a clean ending would have been. Fear works as a film because it understands the material it is working with and constructs its narrative accordingly. The psychological territory it covers is handled with clinical restraint rather than sensationalism. The performances, particularly from Reese Witherspoon as Nicole and Mark Wahlberg as David, are grounded in character logic rather than genre convention. What the film grasps, and what most thrillers in this space do not, is that the most effective way to make an audience understand how a controlling dynamic operates is to let them experience the early stages of it without a warning label attached. By the time the label becomes necessary, the film has already done its work. That is why Fear from 1996 holds up, not because of what happens in the third act, because of how carefully it constructed everything that made the third act inevitable. That was Picture Mavericks. If this breakdown gave you a new way into the film, subscribe and stay with us. Every video is built around one idea: that the best stories reward the people who look closer. We will see you in the next frame.